This is an archived episode of the Talk Genealogy Podcast.
This evening we're talking about Robert Cotton and his library.
Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. Here's your presenter, Malcolm Noble.
Hello everyone, thank you for being there and welcome to episode 26 of the Talk Genealogy Podcast. We call it the podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands, and tonight we're going to consider how the work of Sir Robert Cotton set the context for so much that we do nearly 500 years after his death. Now, I know that my listening figures always suffer something of a slump when I profile one of our pioneers instead of talking through a new source, but you know, these people were just like us in so many ways. They got the thrill of handling old documents just like we do, analysing them and, who knows, cataloguing and shelving them into some sort of a collection. So it seems a pity not to get to know them. And I always seem to learn something from whatever they have to say. I guess that they've shown me how to enjoy my hobby, you know, taking time out just to look at the flowers. Thank you for your support as we start on this, our third year together. We're beginning to get known, you know. We had more than a mention on BBC Radio since I recorded the last podcast. They got to hear what we were up to and so called me in for a bit of a Monday morning chat. So I'd like to welcome any new listeners that we've picked up from then. You know, if each one listening to this introduced one new listener, we double our audience overnight.
Wow, that's amazing!
But please don't forget, I'm neither a professional nor an expert. I am no more than an enthusiast, just like you, who has been researching his family tree for nigh on 50 years, and too often getting it wrong. These podcasts are no more than me sharing with you some of the lessons that I've picked up on the way, and I do need to emphasise I am talking about ancestor hunting in England.
Building an audio library with Malcolm Noble.
Here we go. Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries led to the destruction of much of their heritage along with many of their libraries. But we should be wary of casting this loss of old books and documents as simple vandalism. Many men, even educated Tudors, would have regarded documents written in Old English as being unintelligible and so useless. No, they weren't thinking of you and I, genealogists sitting around with too much time on our hands 500 years to come. But on the other hand, the Reformation sparked a renewed interest in Old English, as some scholars sought to look for an English church of old which suffered no interference from Rome. Matthew Parker, the Archbishop of Canterbury, encouraged this research and discussion. This was the same Archbishop Parker who possessed the Parker Chronicle, that is to say, one of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, and usually taken to be the oldest of the surviving copies. So many old documents did become available at this time, and probably the best collection was gathered in by Sir Robert Cotton, which is why I've chosen him as the subject of tonight's talk. Now, Cotton wasn't a genealogist. He had an interest in antiquarian things and was a member of the Society of Elizabethan Antiquarians, but he is important to modern-day family historians because of his legacy. Not simply his library, but also his scholarship. In my previous episode, I read from the historian J.C. Holt, reminding us that historians have evolved clear, straightforward procedures, including the use of charters, court rolls, inquisitions and other materials, along with the known descent of estates for the construction of genealogies and identifications of individuals. It is best, wrote Holt, that we stick to them. Well, a wealth of those sources have come down to us through the Cotton family, and Sir Robert encouraged researchers to consult them and use them properly, though not all genealogists have adhered strictly to that discipline. He was born in 1571 in Huntingdonshire England. So just work out which of your ancestors would have been his contemporary. Yes, I see. He was born when this young family in my family tree was growing up. Oh, and not far from my old family's stomping ground. After Westminster School, he studied at Cambridge and eventually joined one of the Inns of Court. No, my lot went to neither Westminster nor Cambridge. He was at Westminster School when William Camden was the headmaster. Camden was already famous as the author of the County by County Guide of Britannia, originally written in Latin, and he would eventually leave Westminster to take up post as a herald. Cotton became good friends with his headmaster. They even toured the north of England together. This was before express travel, remember, where Cotton noted his observations about Hadrian's Wall and picked up some coins and all sorts of ancient artifacts. At the time that Robert Cotton was assembling his collection, he was part of a group of like-minded scholars called the Society of Elizabethan Antiquarians. Established around 1572, so it was already on its feet when Cotton became involved in 1590. He was too young to be one of the founding members, as suggested in some places. The society generally looked at such subjects as the antiquity of titles, parish and other charters, heraldry and some pedigrees, but would extend its papers to cover anything old and instructive, including archaeology and coins. The leading fellows included William Boyer, keeper of the Tower of London Records Office; William Lombard, local historian who wrote his Perambulation of Kent in 1576; the early genealogist Sir Henry Spelman, who acted as a tutor for William Dugdale; other heralds like Camden himself, and the respected amateur heraldic expert Joseph Holland. By 1608, the Society of Elizabethan Antiquarians had discontinued. It tried to get going again around about 1614, but without much success. The year after the tour of Hadrian's Wall, that's to say 1601, Cotton became a magistrate and was elected to Parliament as a member for Newtown on the Isle of Wight, relying on the patronage of the island's governor, Sir George Carey. He would later represent his home seat of Huntingdonshire, and Cotton was for a time an advisor to King James I, but we shall see that his relationship with the throne of England was not always so comfy. He was already writing influential papers. People looked to him and they wanted to secure an authority for their arguments. Cotton argued that a country was not well governed by a plethora of laws, but by wise interpretation of fundamental laws. I have always seen this as an explanation of our unwritten constitution, drawing on precedents. I know that not everyone would take Cotton's argument that far. Following the suppression of some unrest in the Midlands, where the hurt of field enclosure was most keenly felt by the rural population, Cotton served on a commission to investigate the enclosure policy and implementation, which had sparked the disobedience. Cotton was no liberal and showed little sympathy for the rebellion. He published a paper in defence of enclosure and converting arable lands in the inland shires to pasture. Then, in 1608, he was a major part of a commission to look into corruption in the Admiralty. He actually wrote the final report of that one. By now, his library was significant. He had been gathering manuscripts even as a young man. He received books from William Cecil, the Elizabethan statesman, and John Leyland, who worked on the Abbey Roll. We spoke about him in episode 7 of these podcasts. And he got some from the astronomer John Dee. His library would eventually become the largest collection of Old English manuscripts anywhere, and would include over half of the surviving copies, or part copies, of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, that's to say, 6 examples. He owned a Magna Carta and important copies of the Lindisfarne Gospels, as well as a unique manuscript of Beowulf. He had 2 copies of Bede, and when Camden died in 1623, he left the main part of his heraldic collection to Cotton. More contemporary documents included the will of Mary Queen of Scots, letters of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and even a diary from Edward VI. Talkgenealogy.blog. Here is the website that supports the monthly podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. You'll find links to previous episodes, a full list of books mentioned in the series, 1 or 2 details about other genealogy work I've done, and every now and then, though more then than now, a bit of a blog.
Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Okay, let's have number 4 in our series on old country sayings. When pigs carry sticks, the clouds will play tricks. When they lie in the mud, there's no fear of a flood.
The podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Cotton was always generous with his collection. He loaned items and didn't always get them back. In 1602, he gave more than 10 books to Sir Thomas Bodley at the foundation of the Bodleian Library at Oxford. At the time, Cotton was the most important of Bodley's benefactors. In 1606, a collection was viewed by the French astronomer Nicolas Peresque, and in 1610 by Isaac Casaubon, a classical scholar and linguist, again a Frenchman. Now in 1614, Cotton moved his collection from Blackfriars to the Strand, and in 1622 it was moved again, this time to Cotton's house within the Palace of Westminster. This meant that the second floor library was very much available to Commons members. Anyone walking from St Stephen's Chapel to the Lords would, most likely, cross Cotton's courtyard. So he encouraged the influential folk of the day to use his premises in Westminster as a reference library. In this way, he could easily be seen as a dangerous person. Now, I've always thought that Shakespeare in England was far more interesting than the raw Tudor history. One popular historian, Maurice Ashley, summed it up neatly. He wrote, "The middle of King James I's reign was distinguished by struggles between personalities more extraordinary than they were edifying. Cotton became embroiled in an intrigue and ultimate scandal with this type of people. Somerset, a favourite of King James, was uneasy about James's negotiations with France, and so made some inquiries with the Spanish for an alternative alliance. Cotton began to act as a discreet, if not secret, intermediary in these negotiations. Now, although Somerset was a favourite of King James, it all fell apart in a scandalous, not to say murderous, way. Now, perhaps this story has little to do with tonight's theme, but it's just too good of a story to leave out. Somerset, his birth name was Robert Carr, wanted to marry Frances Howard, but she had been married as a child to the Earl of Essex, the son of Elizabeth Essex. Please, no conspiracy theories. Frances was desperate to get out of that marriage. She'd been a 13-year-old bride, and with the help of compliant bishops and the king, managed to do so. Here ends chapter 1. Chapter 2, Somerset's close friend, Thomas Overbury, had been against the marriage, and Frances hated him, So, chapter 3, she bribed the guards in the Tower of London to poison him. Overbury had been locked in the tower for refusing a diplomatic appointment, which was probably a put-up job in any case. 2 years later, the crime came to light. The guards were executed. Somerset and Lady Frances were pardoned. Well, there you go. That's how things are. Cotton was collateral damage. His place was searched and his work behind the scenes, mediating between the Spanish and Somerset, became apparent. Now, it may be that the king's motive in scapegoating Cotton was to mask his own bad faith during negotiations. So what has all this got to do with the study of genealogy? You know, nothing whatsoever. So let's move on. Charles I, who was king from 1625, was nervous of Cotton's library. He thought it a seat of sedition and feared that it would enhance the credibility of any challenge to the divine right of kings. Remember, the principle of inherited kingship had only been a truly settled concept as far as the English throne was concerned for something like 300 years. Before then, English history shows us that yes, family relationships had been an important part of your claim, but only part of it. As far as Charles I was concerned, Stuart England was not a time when kings wanted educated men to look closely at the concept of the king's divine right. Furthermore, Cotton's house was far too close to Parliament, and Charles feared that members of the Commons might be using arguments drawn from Cotton's library to substantiate their complaints against him. Well, if he didn't fear it, he ought to have done. Charles closed the library down in 1629, and Cotton was even arrested for publishing a critical pamphlet. Some months later, he was released as a celebration of King Charles' birthday. When Cotton died, 2 years later, he was just 60, the library passed to his son, also called Robert, who maintained and expanded it. Some people say that Cotton died pining for his books. From the foundation laid by Cotton and his contemporaries grew the school of local history writers, which we discussed in episode 2 of these podcasts. Burton's Leicestershire, Erderick's Staffordshire, Carew's Cornwall, and of course Lombard's Kent were all written, if not published, between 1576 and 1622. In his book English Genealogy, Sir Anthony Wagner looked at the work of Cotton, the Society of the Elizabethan Antiquarians, and the early local historians, contemporaries or so nearly contemporaries of one another, and he saw by the early 1600s there was a network of antiquarians spread through the country with a scholarly approach to documents, helped by legal training and an ardour for genealogies in relation at once to local history, family history, and the safeguarding of the rights of property. And that was taken from Wagner's book, English Genealogy. Roger Dodsworth, who died in 1654, was another notable researcher who grew out of this school. Son of a chancellor to archbishops of York, as a young man he was already drawing pedigrees from church monuments and documents. He worked in Cotton's library and in the Tower of London's Records Office. Although his main interest was Yorkshire, he worked on 3 mammoth tasks: the study of monastic charters, a baronage of England, and a history of Yorkshire. He completed none, but his works in progress were used by others. The Bodleian collection of his work fills 116 volumes. Sir Henry Spelman, of the Society of Elizabethan Antiquarians, had encouraged William Dugdale to work with Dodsworth on the monastic charters, and he went on to complete them and the baronage. Probably the greatest of them all was William Dugdale, but apart from that glowing mention, I won't say too much more about him here, because we looked at him in some depth again in the second episode of these podcasts. And once I start talking about Dugdale, I find it difficult to stop. As for the Cotton collection, it was after the death of the third generation, John Cotton, that the library was left to the public. The terms of that bequest are even detailed in an Act of Parliament of 1701, which states that it is to be kept and preserved for public use and advantage, and that it cannot be sold or otherwise disposed of. Now, in one sense, this was the first time that the public or the state had become responsible for a library of its heritage. 30 years later, there was something of a disaster when Ashburnham House, where the collection was held, was burned down. Much was lost, but much was saved. In 1753, it became part of the collection of the new British Museum, and so became one of the starting off points for the British Library that we know today. Today, the British Library's Cotton collection runs to over 1,400 manuscripts and a similar number of charters, rolls and seals. And this includes the largest collection of Anglo-Saxon manuscripts anywhere in the world.
Here's some earlier episodes of the podcast. Episode 15. Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Episode 13 was about the hearth tax. Episode 12, and it was Shakespeare, for example. Episode 9 discussed the medieval pipe rolls. Go to episode 7 for the companions of William the Conqueror. Episode 2, the Herald's Visitations, and our very first episode looked at working with Tudor wills. Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
For tonight's retrospective, I thought we'd go back 12 months and look at episode 14, which considered the poll books of Old England. That episode is still available. You can click through the website. So let's take a bit of an eavesdrop and see what was going on. The December 1832 election was the first poll after the Great Reform Act of that year, which extended the franchise, making it much more likely that our ancestors were able to vote. But this criteria was not uniform, and it had been possible to vote in some boroughs as long as you had a house large enough for a cooking pot. These people, whose votes could readily be bought or dictated, we assume, were called the pot wallopers. Now, there's a lovely word. Neither was there an overall distaste for selling your vote. There is the famous example of New Shoreham, where over 80 voters got together and sold their vote en bloc to the highest bidder during the 1770s. And this block was the majority of the voters, so New Shoreham was regularly sorted, and it wasn't alone. And as I say, that episode is still available on the website talkgenealogy.blog. Just go to the episode page and click on episode 14. So, what was Robert Cotton's legacy for the genealogists with too much time on their hands? In assessing this, oddly, I want to put aside the documents that he preserved and which we might visit, and I want to come at it from a different starting point. It may be that that Act of Parliament encapsulates it best. We can see how so much grew out of the country's acceptance of a statutory responsibility for the library. Certainly the British Library, and probably the Public Records Office, now the National Archive. Is that pitching it too high? It could also be argued that Cotton's initial gift to the Bodleian helped to set that library's course. And would the Society of Elizabethan Antiquarians have been so effective without Cotton's resources and energies? Then we could talk about the growth of a disciplined scholarship, and recall that quotation from Holt at the beginning of this talk. In his book, English Genealogy, Wagner argues that Cotton and his library opened up so many different opportunities, such a broad canvas for the study of history, that genealogy lost ground, and we can cite a drying up of progress, or at least the rate of progress, until the likes of Burn, Hervey and Fenimore get going throughout the 19th century, by which time, of course, there was a growing interest in English roots from America. In a narrow sense, that argument has some good grounds, but I'd like to look at the question in a different, perhaps less parochial way. Cotton revealed benefits of researching from original documents, and that may be one of the reasons for my choosing him as tonight's subject. It was simply to catch the romance of it. It is those sources that bind our pedigree to a broader interpretation of England's history, and if you like, our family's history can feel more part of the nation's past and its growth. So I like to see the opportunities for scholarship which Cotton's work presented as placing genealogy as just one aspect of a broader and integrated understanding of the past. Please remember, the end and scope of all history, to teach by example of times past, such wisdom as may guide our desires and action. But please do be careful. The man who wrote that got his head chopped off. Thank you for listening to episode 26 of the Talk Genealogy Podcast. I know that my listening figures will take something of a dip when I profile a pioneer of genealogy, instead of talking everyone through a news source, so I'm pleased that you've managed to stick with it until the end. The show notes are on the website, and I'll be reading them when the music stops. As usual, my thanks goes to Emily Brooks for the voiceovers, Freeze Effects for the music, and I'll be posting episode 27 in about 3 weeks' time. If you're a genealogist with too much time on your hands, I hope that you'll be there to catch the talk. Until then, I'd like to wish you good night and God bless. Any questions or comments? Any ideas or suggestions? You can contact the podcast through the website talkgenealogy.blog or through the Facebook page, and there's Twitter, of course. On social media, just search for Talk Genealogy. In this episode, I read from Sir Anthony Wagner's English Genealogy, J.T. Holt's Robin Hood, and quoted from Maurice Ashley's England in the 17th Century. I also referred to And the Early Stuarts by Godfrey Davis, The Earliest Antiquaries by Graham Parry, and episodes of our podcast, number 2, Dugdale and the Herald's Visitations, and number 7, William the Conqueror and the Battle Abbey Roll. I would also like to recommend episode 58 of Kevin Stroud's podcast, The History of the English Language, and episode 58 covers bibliophiles and book collectors, including a profile of Robert Cotton. Thank you for listening.
This has been an archived episode of the Talk Genealogy Podcast. Please take a look at our back catalog and let us know if you would like any other episodes to be reposted.